Call the 17th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance to order. Our orders today, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, study on measures to enhance credit availability and the stability of the Canadian financial system. We have four distinguished guests with us here this morning. We have, first of all, from TD Bank Financial Group, we have Mr. Don Drummond. Welcome. We have from the Conference Board of Canada, we have Mr. Glenn Hodgson. From the C.D. Howe Institute, we have Mr. Finn Poshman. And from the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, we have Mr. Ted Millett. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us here this morning. If we can start in that order of organization, and we have allocated about 5 minutes for an opening statement, if you can try to stick to that as best as possible. And then we'll do questions from members. So, Mr. Drummond, we'll begin with you at any time. Don?
Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. I submitted beforehand a set of charts and tables on credit. I think I see it in front of everybody. I won't go through that one by one, but just make some overview remarks about that. One of the reasons I did that is to try to put the discussion of credit in a bit broader context. It's quite often the discussion about solely what banks are doing, but of course there's traditionally a variety of other sources of credit available. The first thing that's obvious from those charts of credits is bank credit is growing quite strongly. And in fact, unlike in previous recessions when the economy has weakened up, credit from the banks has not slowed down. And for both households and businesses, it is growing at a double-digit range. This will likely soften, and in fact, since I sent those charts out to you, we do have one more month of data, and the double-digit pace of growth of bank lending to business has dropped into the very high single digits. It just slightly dropped below 10%. And as I said, if you look back in previous cycles, there's always been the pattern that as economies weaken, particularly nominal GDP has weakened, you've seen the demand for lending from the banks soften up. On the household side, the lending continues to go from the banks at a double-digit range. The lines of credit are growing particularly strongly. They're growing at a more than 20% annual pace, but we've seen traditional household loans and credit cards and mortgages also growing very strongly. Just putting it in a broader context, we have to go, the main source of funds for companies is typically retained earnings. And retained earnings have held up in Canada quite well until recently. And in fact, if you look through 2002 through 2006, retained earnings in Canada were extraordinarily strong. And there wasn't actually a large demand for bank lending during that period because companies were funding it internally. That, of course, has softened towards the end of 2008, and we expect that that will get hit quite hard in 2009, not only by the real economy being weak, but also the drop in commodity and other prices. So if we look at the total market financing, there has been an increase in the reliance upon external funding, and I'll go through some of those sources. Share issuances and bond issuances were reasonably strong in Canada, although they did decline from 2007. We did, as I mentioned before, on the bank side, we had the largest increase ever in Canada's history in bank lending in 2008. That certainly did fill some of the gap left by some of the other sources of fundings, but not the complete source. I've also included for you some pieces of data on credit from the United States. And the thing that's remarkable in the United States is that despite what we typically read in the newspapers, the bank lending actually in the United States is continuing to grow, as that all the other sources of credit have virtually disappeared. So once again, in 2008, there was actually negative issuances of shares. In other words, companies bought back more shares than they issued shares. There was virtually no issuances of corporate bonds. There was very little trade credit. And there was a virtual disappearance of the other sources, the shadow banking system, if you want, the non-banks, the hedge funds, the subsidiaries of companies that were in the financial arm. So in the United States, we really did see that the banks were really the only game in town, and while they did increase their lending, clearly it didn't fill the gap left by other sources, and we did have a problem with credit. I gave you a couple of charts as well on the cost of credit. This has been a major issue over the last couple of years, and I split that into two, the short-term and the medium-term cost. On the short term, there is good news. We have had a restoration of something approximating normalcy in the short end of corporate markets. Commercial paper rate is operating again. The cost of borrowing at the very short term, up to about 90 days, has come down quite a lot. It blew up in the wake of the Lehman Brothers failure, and it's been coming down steadily. In particular, the last 2 months has come down quite a bit. The spreads are still not as low as they were prior to the summer of 2007, but that part of the market, the very short term, is working reasonably well. And it's probably, you would have seen the stories of the last couple of days, the last auction from the Bank of Canada providing 28-day funding was not fully subscribed from the banks, and I think one of the reasons was they're able to go to the market and get funding at that duration themselves. The remaining problem continues to be at the medium and the longer term. The spreads on medium-term bonds in the corporate market are extraordinarily high. And we really have to condition ourselves to not think about monetary policy in the traditional fashion. We tend to look at the central bank rate and think that's what's happening to all interest rates, and that is not the case. We've got quite low mortgage rates. We've got very low Government of Canada bond rates, very low U.S. government treasury rates, but the corporate bond spreads are extraordinarily high. If you think back to prior to the summer of 2007, on average, a Canadian bank could have raised 5-year fundings at 50 basis points above the Government of Canada rate. Our own bank was substantially below that. Until about a month ago, a Canadian bank would have faced a 300 basis point spread to raise 5-year funding. So they went from less than 50 basis points to about 300 basis points. That's creeped in a little bit recently, but not very much. So we still have credit markets gummed up on that medium to longer term on the corporate side. Hopefully the announcements of Geithner in the United States, and hopefully what we might see in Canada in terms of quantitative easing, if that gets into corporate bond markets, will bring down that spread. But I think it's the last remaining piece of this puzzle. We need to see some improvement on that before we can have some confidence of a return to normalcy in credit and some economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Drummond. We'll go to Mr. Hodgson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to do something a little bit different. I want to touch just on 4 points in about 5 minutes. What the U.S. is doing, because it's an interesting case study on the biggest credit crisis I think the world's ever faced. Comparing where we are, the fact that I think our system is now in a state of healing, I think a lot of the data that Don just gave you is evidence that we're now on the right path. It's a question really of what more could be done to accelerate the healing. And really, and finally, I want to talk just for a minute about the existing state instruments like BDC and EDC, and frankly, how lucky we are to have them as a backstop for our financial system. So quickly on the U.S., I think the number is up to $10 trillion now of policy intervention. When you add up all the action, the TARP program, the fact that the Bush government got $700 billion from Congress last fall, injected $250 billion into the banking system. We've now seen the kind of action that Don's just referred to with government stepping into particular credit markets, building a program to buy back distressed assets. So it's an incredible degree of intervention we're seeing in the United States. The evidence is hardly clear as to whether it's working yet, but the U.S. has more or less played all its cards. I think quantitative easing is sort of the final card, trying to fight off deflation and really improve conditions in long bond markets at the same time. But the cards are all in. I'm confident that they're going to work, but it's going to take time. I think we're going to watch all of this year, frankly, before we see any semblance of normalcy return to the U.S. financial markets. Now, compare that to what we've seen happen in Canada. I think government policy to this point has been very effective and it's been very well constructed. I think for the most part, governments have done what they had to do in terms of offering to buy back mortgages, for example, the various programs to try and restore credit conditions in credit markets. But bottom line, we haven't seen a dime of taxpayer money go into banks in terms of equity because we haven't had the same sort of crisis. So we're in obviously far better shape than almost anybody in the industrial world, and therefore I would assume that we're going to see a return to more normal conditions in Canada much sooner than we do in almost any other industrial country. But again, it's going to take time. So we're now in healing mode. The fact that we had all the chartered banks report profits in Q4, the fact that they're operating in the black, having to put provisions aside against old bad assets and the decline in credit conditions, obviously very important. It's going to probably hurt their bottom line going forward. But we're in a situation where our system can work in the black, and it's really about the banks right now rebuilding their balance sheets and having healing and dealing with the fact, as Don mentioned, the fact that the non-banks and foreign banks have more or less retreated from our market. And the evidence of that is pretty clear. So what else could be done? Well, you know, I thought about that as I gave advice to the government in the budget context and hadn't had a chance to appear before you before. But it's really hard for me to come up with a magic solution at this point. There's no magic wand. There clearly is no silver bullet. The fact that we're getting evidence now that the full mortgage buyback program is not going to get taken up, I think is a real sign of healing going on in markets. I don't know what cards, frankly, government has left to play, except within the assets that you own. And here's where I'll wrap up. I think we're very lucky to have organizations like Export Development Canada, BDC, Farm Credit, CCC, as a real key player within our financial system. And I know that there's been debate for a long time about privatization, about whether they're taking too big a market share. But aren't we lucky to have such strong institutions as a backstop for the commercial banks and for the private financial system right now, where they're players through the market cycle. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have the balance sheet, frankly, to step up right now and fill gaps. I had a chance to appear before the Senate committee earlier this week on the EDC legislation. I hope that when it comes back to the House that it gets passed as quickly as possible, because it's time to take time away from management. Management should not have to think about the rules of operation. They should really have the chance now to use the added share capital they've been given and the expanded mandate and really try and accelerate the healing of our financial system right now. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hodgson. We'll go Mr. Poshman, please. Next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the committee for inviting me. I think this is my first visit to the committee in 2009. It's a delight to be back and to see familiar faces and some new ones as well. I want to start with some observations on financial market performance, turn to what the government and the Bank of Canada have been doing to respond to recent issues, and look at some specific issues or some specific measures introduced in the 2009 federal budget. I won't rehearse events. Financial market history since the summer of 2007, I'm sure, is well known to this committee. Simple enough to say that since mid-2007, doubts about the quality of assets underlying a broad range of securities and the financial derivatives layered thereon drove a meltdown of trust among financial institutions. And that the meltdown was so profound that banks that had earlier engaged in short-term lending to each other at interest rate spreads counted in the single or very low digits, low double digits, relative to risk-free lending. They either ceased to do so, they ceased to provide liquidity to their neighbors, or would do so only at rates otherwise unknown in recent financial history. So this rocketing up of risk assessments of counterparty risk as between financial institutions reflects in part a contraction in financial liquidity. What became clear, though, through late 2007 into 2008 is that there's more to the story than liquidity. After all, governments and central banks have been providing, across the Western world, and including in Canada, had providing liquidity to the system by the trillion when you add it all up. So, however, the risk spreads, especially since fall 2008, were in triple digits, but we should add very quickly that they're down near to normal levels in Canada, although the amount, the volume of lending that's going on isn't so high. But what had become clear is that the counterparty risk I described was a more persistent problem than the liquidity problem. And governments in Canada began to pay more attention to improving the quality of assets on financial institutions' balance sheet. Hence, the United States Troubled Asset Relief Program, and as originally conceived in fall 2008, and the Insured Mortgage Purchase Program that's been operative in Canada for some months now. Budget 2009 significantly expanded the capital available to the Canadian government to buy Canada Housing mortgage-backed securities from financial institutions. The mortgages underlying those securities were already contingent liabilities from the point of view of the government's books and from the point of view of the federal taxpayer, so our risk exposure changes little, while the program does offer marginal improvements in the quality of domestic institutions' balance sheets. And it seems to have been working really reasonably well, and as Glenn just pointed out, the fact that there's been less take-up in recent weeks is in fact suggestive of the program that has in part perhaps run its course. And so far so good. In Canada, notwithstanding numerous contrary anecdotes, bank lending overall has continued to grow, not shrink. To be sure, there is some flatlining in 2008 and late 2008, but the fact remains that overall bank lending in Canada is up in the past year and not down. To say as much, however, is not to ignore the existence of significant financial market troubles. Most obviously, the collapse of several securities and derivatives markets, and as well as much hedge fund activity, has crushed numerous non-bank financial intermediation channels, and Don mentioned this, meaning that the broad supply of credit for the Canadian economy, like that elsewhere, has come under severe pressure. The asset-backed securities market in Canada, for instance, was at the end of 2008 about 4/7 the size it was at the end of the previous year. So governments have launched new measures that aim beyond the financial institution marketplace that regularly engages with the Bank of Canada. The key Canadian exhibit would be the Canadian Secured Pardon me, it's got a terrible acronym, the Canadian Secured Credit Facility, CSCF, outlined in Budget 2009. And this is intended to jumpstart the more bund vehicle and equipment lease and loan marketplace. The program's not yet fully formed. Yesterday, the City Howe Institute released a brief on the potential shape of the program, which will be run by BDC. Our brief, which is what was written by Alexandre Laurent, who's well known to many members of this committee, makes a few simple points. First is that if the government is committed to restoring the lease and loan market to something like its recent form, a long job is ahead of it. It will almost certainly be necessary to commit more than the $12 billion contemplated in the budget. The second point is that if the program is to succeed, it must become active fairly quickly, certainly before summer this year, and to the extent possible, it should take advantage of existing securitization channels. That said, we can't forget that there are risks involved. No doubt the Canadian ABS marketplace has been hurt by contagion from other types of securities in other markets, and that's chased off investors. And perhaps the rollout of the new program will make this will make the market perform better and bring back retail and commercial investors. It may do, as well as improve the financing available to auto and equipment dealers. But we cannot forget, should not for a moment forget, that there's a reason investors left the marketplace. And while acknowledging that no Canadian AAA-rated ABS has failed to this point, markets remain unsettled by potential increases in default rates among underlying loans and leases, as well as declining residual values on vehicle leases. These worries can't and shouldn't be wished away. So to sum up, partway through an extraordinarily difficult economic period, some things appear to be working better on their own. Others, such as mortgage markets, appear to have been improving with a little help from government actions to improve the balance sheets of mortgage lenders in particular. Other parts of the financial marketplace have been performing far less well. Hence actions, as we talked about in Canada and the U.S., to jumpstart securitization markets. I'm hesitant to say this is a bad idea, but I must immediately add that one of the lessons we learned from 2007 is that we can spread risk around, but we can't make it go away. Efforts to entice investors back to the securitization marketplace by lifting risk from that market, as we've seen in the U.S. and may yet see in Canada, inevitably parks risk at taxpayers' doorsteps. And that, in turn, is something on which parliamentarians should be keeping a very close eye. And I think with that, my time is up, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Poshman. We'll go to, finally, Mr. Millett, please.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting us to present to you today. CFIB represents 105,000 small, mid-sized business owners, and it's a sector that accounts for a major share of GDP, roughly 45%, and certainly a large amount of demand for operational capital financing. So it's an area that we have been monitoring for decades, both on the financing and the economic performance side. Historically, we have conducted studies, say, on a 3-year rolling basis on bank financing. And on the economy side, we've been running a quarterly barometer since year 2000. And before that, we ran it on an annual basis, really back to 1987. So we have a huge amount of context through good times and bad in terms of how small businesses are responding to tough economic times. Yesterday, we released our business barometer. You have it in front of you. There's really something there for both the optimists and the pessimists. The pessimists will see that clearly we're in a trough, and 87.3 is our index level compared to 1988 when we first started doing this kind of measure. Clearly, it's in the category of negative economic growth. However, the good news is that it's really no different than what we found in December. So the view that perhaps the economy has not continued to decelerate over the past 3 months is perhaps positive news if you can take it in that context. What's important is that what you see in Figure 2 is that there are still businesses out there who are successful, who are very successful. It's clearly not as large a number as we had seen in previous years, but it's important to recognize that there are pockets of strength and growth, and that one should never develop policy, or whether it's financial policy or banking policy or sales policy, on the assumption that every business is actually suffering, when in fact many of them are actually still doing well. You'll see that GDP does track our numbers very closely, and what we're hoping to do, and we're in the plans of developing a monthly barometer for the economy, and we're also looking at combining that with some financing indicators as well. So we are moving forward for the foreseeable future on looking at where business financing demand is and where economic performance is with respect to small firms. There is clearly a retrenchment going on within our membership. We see it in the numbers. One of the most obvious is at the back of the report, looking at capital expenditure plans. That is a figure that really has never changed since we started asking this form of question. We didn't think it was ever going to change, except in the past 6 months, roughly 20% reduction in capital expenditure plans has been noticed. So clearly there's something going on that front. Also, what we've noticed is that basically pricing and wage increase plans have stopped dead. The median price increase and the median wage increase is roughly 0 or 0.5% at this point. So businesses have, where we were concerned about inflationary pressures in mid-2007, those pressures are clearly gone from the system. Now, turning to the financing side, you'll also see a chart summary. This is from our new monthly foray into looking at the demand side of things. Clearly, roughly 50–55% of our members say that they are underfinanced. We don't have the numbers to be able to compare with because these numbers are so new, we don't have it to compare with what happens during better economic times, but comparing that with other surveys, we think that roughly 20% is what you would normally expect under better economic conditions. We also track really, what is the state? Are they borrowing money right now? There's a bit of a good news and bad news there too. About roughly a third of our members don't borrow. They don't have any outstanding loans, which means that they're highly conservative in their approaches to business. It means that they're also less at risk to these kinds of shocks to the economy. The other side of the coin, of course, is that they are not levered to be able to grow as quickly when the economy does pick up. So the small business sector, at least when they're presenting this kind of outlook, shows a high degree of stability, which is a good thing in this context. But it's looking at that as a huge growth opportunity is not there. We also get a sense of where total lending is. Don and a number of others had said that certainly there is greater financing out there, outstanding financing. We've asked our members why this is the case. Typically, most businesses say the reason they have increased their level of debt, largely through outstanding lines of credit, is because of cash flow has slowed down. They have higher expenditures or lower revenues, and that their revolving lines of credit have increased somewhat as a result. So that is perhaps the major reason why small business credit has increased, at least in the short term, past little while. So. We have a number of recommendations. They are the same that they've always been. Really, information on credit and borrowing is absolutely vital in this kind of environment. Ensuring that we have competitive choice and multiple levels of lending opportunities or borrowing opportunities for small firms, and ensuring that financial institutions, whether they be banks or credit unions or others, really have the skills to properly assess the level of risk of the small and mid-sized business market. So those are the sort of things that we've always been recommending in the past number of decades. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Millett. Thank you for your presentation. We'll start with Mr. McCallum. You have 7 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to you all. My apologies for being slightly late. What happened was that my colleague, Mr. Mulcair, and I were led to the wrong building by our friend, the parliamentary secretary over there.
Our former friend.
Not maliciously, I might say. There's an element of humor in this meeting because the government was pushing for you gentlemen to be included in the same session as the parliamentary budget officer on the assumption that you would offer a measure of protection to the government from his projections. But I believe, and this is a question to Mr. Drummond, that whereas the parliamentary budget officer projected a two-year deficit of $73 billion, $9 billion higher than the government, that TD is projecting $82 billion which is 18 billion higher than the government. And I also think, and I'd ask you to confirm whether this is correct, that just looking at the charts, and this is partly on the basis of consensus and maybe some personal input from the parliamentary budget officer, he's projecting for the year 2009 GDP, real GDP to fall by about 2%, nominal GDP by about 4%, an average unemployment rate of about 8.4%. So am I right in thinking that on all four counts the TD forecast is more pessimistic?
Yeah, true, but actually if you had invited both Glenn and me to appear, you wouldn't have got anywhere because he's at the top of the forecast pile and I'm at the bottom, so we would have just canceled each other out and you would have been right back where the parliamentary budget officer was. I mean, there's a huge range of uncertainty, and yes, for some time we've been at the bottom of the pile of the forecasters, and I must say that has been a good space to be, and in fact we haven't been low enough. Everybody, including us, has till this point having to keep revise it down. We're somewhat weaker than the consensus on the real side. Our biggest distinction has been on the price side, if you will, and it's largely we have lower commodity prices, and I'm not quite sure everybody else has figured out appropriately how the low commodity prices feed into our export prices, and hence that depresses incomes in Canada. And it's a particularly important variable. Not only the government revenues don't depend on real GDP. It's always amazed me we talk about the economy solely through the prism of real GDP. They depend on nominal income, but so does the banking world. And in fact, there is traditionally almost a perfect relationship between changes in nominal GDP and banking lending with about a 6-month lag. Okay. And that 6-month lag is exactly what Ted talked about. Your income first goes down, you start first drawing on lines of credit, and then you weaken somewhat later.
So
I was trying to get back to
Niagara Falls.
So
I tried, Chair.
So I think the conclusion I draw from this is that if TD Bank is on the optimistic side and Conference Board on the pessimistic side, the parliamentary budget officer, or the other way around, the parliamentary budget officer is right in the middle, sweetly reasonable. Thank you for that. Let me now turn to credit. And this is really, I think, to Don Drummond and Finn Poschman. I certainly agree 100% with the government's move of, I believe, $12 billion on the auto leasing, and I think it's another approximately $12 billion in lending authorized by BDC and EDC. Where I get extraordinarily frustrated, and my usual laid-back self gets frustrated with the head of BDC, was when he comes and displays zero sense of urgency, because to me the priority is to get that money out in 2009, because now is when the problem is, not 2010 or 11 or 12. And I think that both BDC and the car leasing facility, and Finn Poschman says that yesterday you come up with the potential shape of it. Well, how long will it take before it actually happens? It could have happened some weeks or months ago, and people today would be buying more cars. And businesses crying out for those loans from BDC, and the head of BDC was not even able to tell me anything about when any money would get out the door. So I have a double question to both. I'll begin with Finn Poschman. One, do you agree that there's a sense of urgency in getting this money out the door? And second, if you do you have confidence that this money can move quickly? Because we certainly haven't been told anything that would inspire such confidence.
Can you each take about a minute to answer?
Sure. I'll go very quickly. The lease and loan financing industry and the auto sector and the vehicle sector, they certainly perceive a sense of urgency in seeing financing move quickly. Absolutely they do. From the point of view of designing and running a program, however, there are just a few things that you have to get right. One of the issues is that we're talking about government buying securities from a marketplace of a form that don't actually exist yet. So it is possible that the government could use existing channels of securitization. However, if we want credit-enhanced products, as described in the budget, if we want them to provide adequate taxpayer protection, it's going to take just a little bit of time to design and bring those securities to market. The sector can do it. The program will roll out, as I understand it, in the very near future. I also understand it'd be quite reasonable to look for a rollout in June this year.
Mr. Drummond?
Roll up, Wayne. I can't answer very definitively on BDC because we've not had a long history of collaborative arrangement with BDC, unlike EDC. EDC is a very close partner of us. In fact, TD does the most business of all the banks with EDC, and it's been a wonderful partnership. And I really have a sense of confidence that if a loan proposition is made to us that we're uncomfortable, we will be able to involve EDC and make an arrangement that will allow them to go forward. And we've had nothing but excellent exchanges with them previous to the budget, but also in particular with the recapitalization and the possibilities afterwards. BDC, I'm hopefully we can get some kind of arrangement with that, but we just haven't had that track record historically with them.
You have time for one.
Well, I had zero complaint about EDC. I was focusing entirely on BDC. So it sounds like both of you are agnostic or non-committal on that subject.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, that would be a reasonable characterization. There is one point that I just wanted to add, and it's a very important point, is that the program won't succeed if people don't start, if consumers and businesses don't return to the loan and lease vehicle marketplace. If they don't come back, the program won't work. And this is one issue where the government can provide a program, but it's the market that has to look after what happens next.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. McCallum. Monsieur Laforêt.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Drummond, the TD Bank Financial Group was one of the rare organizations in Canada and also in Quebec that I would say did not get involved in the whole ABC paper fiasco. The qualities of an economist include being able to tell the future. And tell me, what was in your crystal ball that indicated to you that it would not be good or safe to head into the same direction as other financial institutions? For me, the answer is very simple. If we look at ABC paper in Canada, when other institutions in Canada were purchasing asset-backed commercial paper, there was a 17% risk. And for us, if the spread was 100 basis points in these capital markets, but for 17 basis points, it just wasn't good enough. The only thing I can tell you is that to our mind, it was so obvious. In fact, I wonder why other financial institutions decided otherwise. In the U.S., there was the subprime market, and we decided that it was a market that we did not want to venture into. We did not want to give out the same type of mortgages that were being given out in the U.S. It was 100% clear for us. As of 2005, we saw that those mortgages had no down payments, that there were people who were simply not creditworthy. And in fact, the whole market was a disaster. But for me, it was abundantly clear that it was bad. I don't know why other institutions went into it. I think it's a question that has to be addressed to other financial institutions because it was so obvious to the TD Bank Financial Group. So if it was so obvious for you, why then were there other interests that were cited? Were there any other reasons that would have compelled, for example, the Caisse de dépôt du Québec to purchase in disproportionate volumes this commercial paper? What I'd like to know is, well, we know that the governor of the Bank of Canada said that as of 2005, the Bank of Canada had issued some warnings about ABCP. were you convinced at the time that that commercial paper was toxic? In fact, I met with Alan Greenspan in Toronto, and I asked him the same question because he was behind the subprime mortgages. In fact, as early as 2002, but there was no regulation in place. And I asked him why. U.S. subprime was not becoming a problem before 2005. And I personally was not happy with his answer. When we realized that the market was in trouble, why didn't the central bank impose any regulations? And he didn't give me a good answer, really. In Canada, there is an organization. In fact, there's the Bank of Canada. There's also other surveillance organizations. So should anyone have been responsible for issuing warnings? Well, there are the credit rating agencies, such as the DBRS, that are responsible for handing out credit ratings. As a bank, we're not responsible for that because we employ more people who analyze risk. The same applies to other financial institutions. When we look at non-bank ABCP, there was a bundle of assets and securities. There were car loans and all sorts of things. For us, the risk was unknown. So when the risk is unknown, we don't get involved. We don't venture into that. Or else we ask for a very high rate. But the rate was practically zero. The risk was put at practically zero. There is a document that you have submitted, which is in English only, and it's unfortunate that it wasn't translated because we would have been able to listen more attentively to your remarks had it been translated. You say that Canada paid attention to the quality of assets. By making such a statement, one can assume that Canada and its financial institutions were perhaps not paying as close attention to the quality of assets?
I'm to translate in advance, so apologies for that. Is the implication of government measures to improve the quality of assets on financial institutions' balance sheet necessarily that those financial institutions did not do a good job of assessing the risk underlying those assets on their balance sheet? It's a good question. It's one that we don't actually have to try to answer because we can observe that the risk spread on interbank lending among financial institutions, which had soared to very high levels in first midsummer 2007 and then again in September and October 2008, those spreads were very, very high. We suspect that the reason for that was lack of trust among the institutions about the quality of those assets.
Allow me to clarify my question, please. You say that Canada only began paying attention to the quality of actives. Who are you referring to exactly? Which Canadian authorities are you referring to?
The insured mortgage purchase program is intended to lift mortgages from financial institutions' balance sheets, right? So that's run by Canada's Treasury. What we're doing is substituting Government of Canada securities on the bank's books for mortgage-backed securities, which were already insured by the Government of Canada on those books. So the risks implicit in those were fairly well understood, I think. The reason for doing so, however, is to create improvements on the margin of the degree to of the amount of certainty that other institutions, both in Canada and abroad, feel about the quality of Canadian institutions' balance sheets.
Okay. Monsieur Laforêt. Merci, Monsieur Laforêt.
So that means that things were operating poorly before.
Gentlemen, for your presentations this morning. There's an event happening in Ontario today that we haven't talked about. I think we all know the Ontario budget is due to be released later today, and there's been a lot of speculation in the media about possible harmonization of the provincial sales tax with the GST. And I was wondering if some of you might comment on that. I note that in my city of Mississauga, our Board of Trade, Mississauga Board of Trade, has said in a recent press release, harmonization of Ontario's sales tax with the GST will lead to a stronger economy with higher real wages, a higher standard of living, higher productivity, lower business costs, and increased investment. That was from the President and CEO of the Mississauga Board of Trade. And I also know that a number of members of this panel have extensively studied the issue, including Mr. Poshman, who I believe released a report just last week. And Mr. Poshman, you advocated harmonization and noted Ontario workers, employers, and consumers, not to mention the rest of Canada, would benefit from an Ontario government decision to implement sales tax reform and to do so without hesitation. The province sorely needs near-term and long-term boosts to its growth and investment outlook, which sales tax reform with appropriate policy fine-tuning can deliver. Then you further went on to say that revising Ontario's archaic retail sales tax and adopting a value-added tax like the GST would sharply lower the effective tax rate on new business investment and offer the province a much-needed economic boost. I wonder if you could give us a little short summary of your views on harmonization, and also compare it to past experiences when other provinces in the 90s harmonized their provincial sales taxes with GST. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. It's an intriguing measure to contemplate in current circumstances, because when we look at financial market turmoil and economic turmoil, it's tax reform, especially sales tax reform, isn't obviously the first thing that a lot of us would reach for. However, we're presented with just a fascinating opportunity for change in Ontario. The Ontario government, I think to this point, it would be fair to say, has not been roundly applauded for its economic management, and seizing the moment for change in Ontario would be a terrific thing. And here's why: sales taxes, retail sales taxes, are dumb taxes because they stack up costs of business, they raise costs to consumers, they raise the cost of new business investment in plant, equipment, processes, and that slows down investment, slows down wage growth, and it boosts the cost of our exports, so that harms our competitiveness in international markets. The opportunity for reform, in particular value-added tax reform, is that the costs that businesses are forced to build into their price of products are simply stripped out by way of the credit invoice system. That means there's a sharp reduction in the effective tax rate on new business investment, and that tends to drive growth in investment, and then wages and productivity. What happened in 1997 when the eastern provinces harmonized at a slightly lower rate than they were taxing before is just a terrific example. The prices of some things, of course, that hadn't been taxed before under provincial tax went up. Other things stayed the same. Other things, and still other prices, went down. Overall, the broad price level in the eastern provinces dropped by roughly the amount of the decline in the net tax rate. So the competitive markets delivered a very quick pass-through of the lower tax on consumer prices. Even better was the boost to investment. Now, you have to do some fancy footwork to strip out the economic growth that was already happening in the eastern economies. The oil and gas were taking off in 1990s, in the mid to late 1990s. When you adjust for all that, you still find that there is a pop in investment per capita of better than 10%, post-reform. That's a huge shock. It's a long-lasting positive shock, and it's been a tremendous tremendous boost to the provincial economies. Lowers costs for businesses because they only have one set of sales tax to comply with. Lowers costs for governments too. So there's wins on all sides. There's wins for consumers, wins for business, wins for federal and provincial governments. That's why we encourage reform, and that's why I'm just delighted and hopeful that Ontario's budget today will in fact put forward a sales tax reform program.
So it sounds like this could be a much-needed shot in the arm for the Ontario economy and the Canadian economy. Thanks for your comments. Do any of the other gentlemen wish to comment? Mr. Mellon?
He has had a lot of experience in GST. We were there for the implementation back in 1990. We did a lot of research in European countries on what they did right, what they did wrong, and certainly a lot went wrong with the implementation of GST. I mean, small businesses supported the notion of the value-added tax as much more efficient than the old manufacturing sales tax. But one of the non-negotiables from our perspective was keeping the base as simple and the same as possible. And of course, we don't know what the announcement is for later today, but it sounds like they're talking about a separate base in Ontario compared to the rest of Canada. And we feel that that's probably a very bad move in that respect, and that it's probably a slippery slope for other provinces if they do tend to harmonize, will create their own tax bases, then you're losing a lot of the benefits of harmonization by each province choosing what to tax and what not to tax. Because the cost of compliance for small firms in collecting the tax is one of the highest of all the tax systems, and so that's a very large concern. And then, of course, we also have lots of members on the other side of currently in the non-tax categories of restaurant food or fuel delivery, all those sorts of elements that are quite concerned about the tax. But it's on balance, in theory, it's one of these things that we want to see, but we think that there's some implementation problems that may come up as a result of today's announcement.
Thank you. Mr. Hodgson?
Yeah, very briefly, Mr. Hodgson.
We put a brief out in the spring actually calling for harmonization of sales taxes, built largely on the good work that C.D. Howe has done, because we agreed with all that analysis. I think one of the big challenges to this point has been the revenue shock that Ontario is going to experience. And estimates are between $500 million to $1 billion of lost revenue, particularly if you add on something like the GST credit for low income. So presumably there's going to be assistance from the federal government in the rollout. I know that's been a big part of the dialogue for the last even 2 years. In fact, frankly, it was a debate about numbers, whether the number was enough. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see an announcement today dealing with some of Ted's issues. Hopefully we'll see a transition period towards a normalization of the base, so we have a common base, but also federal assistance to allow the transition to take place.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Monsieur Mulcair.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's my turn to address a few words to Mr. Poshman. He knows full well, as much as I do, that his document is only 6 pages long. The title is C.D. Howe Celebrating 50 Years. In fact, the document is only 6 pages. It is drafted by somebody who has a French-sounding name. I don't think that an institution of your stature should not be able to provide a bilingual 6-page document. In fact, for this committee, it is prohibited to circulate unilingual documents. I think out of respect, the C.D. Howe should have respected the rule of bilingualism. In fact, I, for many years, was responsible for translating legislation in Manitoba, and I know that 6 pages of text can be translated very quickly. I think the C.D. Howe could have done much better, honestly. But Mr. Hodgson, I want to go back on one of your statements. It was quite interesting. You said it sort of in passing, but I think it deserves some attention. You said that you were not convinced that the government was not making any mistakes, that we were not making any mistakes. And it was rather complicated because $100 billion is $1 trillion, and now we are at $10,000 billion. In your presentation, you expressed concerns, fears about some of our current actions and how they can entail consequences later on, because the train is moving very, very quickly. Can I ask you to elaborate, please?
we're frankly in a grand experiment right now. I mean, none of us have ever seen this before. That's part of the reason why Don and I have such huge challenges doing economic forecasts right now. By the way, ours is out in 2 weeks. It's going to be more dark. So unfortunately, Mr. McCallum, the average is probably going down over the course of the next few weeks. But it's a grand experiment, and it's almost learning by doing. It's what I saw. Maybe a little story. Early in my career, I had a chance at the Federal Department of Finance to work on the Latin American debt crisis. And it took the world 4 years to understand that when countries can't afford to pay, you have to be prepared to reduce principal. It took us 4 years to reach that point. And I think
You have to be prepared to? If countries can't afford to pay, you have to be prepared
to reduce principal, to actually mark down the face value of the loans. Because if people can only afford to pay 80 cents on the dollar, there's no point pursuing them for 2 decades trying to get 100 cents back. It just won't work. You can reduce interest rates, but the stock of debt is really the critical issue. And I see the same sort of learning by doing process right now happening on a global basis with respect to the financial crisis. Look where Mr. Paulson came from in the course of 1 month in September. Complete belief that you should allow institutions to fail, to stepping up and recapitalizing the banks. I mean, he went from a total reversal of attitude in the space of 1 month. And the same sort of thing is happening over the course of this year, I think, the learning by doing. What I see the U.S. government doing, frankly, is almost experimenting. They try something. If it works, they go on. If it doesn't work, they try something else. Clearly, there's going to be responses. There's things we can't anticipate perfectly that are going to happen. For example, if the asset stripping program that Secretary Geithner has announced goes forward, where you have $1 of private capital for every $5 of public capital, an extraordinary ratio. I mean, almost all the risk is being taken still by the private sector. But the private capital is needed to set the price of the distressed assets in the markets. But there's going to be negative things fall out of that. For example, suddenly banks will have to market all those assets. They may actually need more capital. So you may see some major money center banks in the United States requiring even further state capital injections, which may have consequences down the road. That's the kind of thing I was talking about. I think we're on the right path. I think as governments learn by doing, starting with the equity injections, which is something that the academics tell us is almost always the bottom line in a financial crisis. Governments step up and recapitalize banks. That's been done. We're now looking at taking the bad assets off the banks, balance sheets of the United States, but we really don't know what the end state is. We think we know the direction in which the train is moving.
We know that
but
Canada,
we could well be sideswiped by
Canada's
other events
banks
along the
don't
way.
have the same type of bad assets that are being called toxic assets as the Americans. And Mr. Drummond made a good description of that
like
conto. Nothing close to it. And yet, your description of asset-backed commercial paper, for having practiced commercial law for a long time, I'm always amused by the fact that you can draft reams of documents like this and charge your appropriate hourly rate, and nobody's actually going to read the darn things. And I have a feeling that there was a little bit of that going on with ABCPs. I mean, it was as you said, it was bundled, but nobody was actually saying, well, what's this? I spoke with Stephen Jaroslawski about that, and I asked him if he had invested in ABCPs, and not falsely modest, he just, with being himself, said, no, I didn't touch them. He says, I didn't understand them. So how come all the smart people in the banks bought them?
Because they wanted 17 basis point higher return. And I assume they didn't do what I would have thought was appropriate risk management. But we know that through the work of Purdy Crawford and others, it took them more than a year to penetrate into that box to figure out what was in that box. So it wasn't, though, that they could have got into the box if they'd put another hour and paid that hourly rate. That took a big committee, a lot of lawyers, a year to figure out. And still then, there was elements of what was backing those that was still not known.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Mulcair, we'll go to Mr. McKay, please.
It's remarkable, Chair, how regardless of what the economic conditions are, the bankers and the lawyers seem to end up with the money in their pockets. I just want to keep track of this ever-escalating deficit. The government's in the wildly optimistic side of 74. The budgetary parliamentary officer was at 73 yesterday. Mr. Drummond, I take it you're projecting about 82. And Mr. Hodson is about to change his position from only optimistic to possibly even worse than Mr. Drummond. Is that a fair synopsis of where the government's projections are at this point? Where the deficit is at this point?
Well, why don't I speak to our forecast, what's happening right now? I mean, I've got 32 guys back at the shop who model everything in the country, and we do our forecast on a quarterly cycle. What we're seeing happening right now in the economy is a very sharp, I was going to say collapse, but it's a strong word, but a sharp impact on investment. We are now heading into a period where Canada could have a worse quarter than the United States by a lot. I won't put a number on it, but certainly something, a contraction of more than 5% first quarter is going to be in our forecast. And so that naturally will lead us to mark down our growth forecast for the whole year. Like Don, I don't know whether you're deflation or not. We still see a little bit of inflation, so nominal, there could be nominal income growth in the economy. But certainly having the economy contract by 2%, let's say about 2%, because we'll finalize the number in the next 10 days, over the course of this year is going to have an impact on government revenues, and will make the deficit a little bit deeper. Now, of course, we can afford it. You know, and
So
all the work I did, well, all the writing I did over the course of the last 2 months has been to explain to Canadians the fact that having a debt-GDP ratio of 30% means you can provide stimulus for, let's say, 2 years. Quite affordable going forward. The challenge will be when we get back to growth. Are we going to get back to balanced budgets fast enough? And that's the challenge that this committee is going to grapple with 2 or 3 years down the road.
Yeah. I wanted to go to another question with respect to this shift in credit. Yes, it's right to say that the banks are issuing more credit. It's also correct to say that the non-bank actors have left the shop. Therefore, the banks have moved in and arguably creamed the good stuff and left the taxpayer in the form of BDC, EDC, and the rest with less than optimum credit. A lot of us are hearing, including folks from the CFIB folks, that the banks and other financial institutions such as Visa and MasterCard are really starting to crank up the cost of credit. And so you see actually credit constricting. I want to get a response to that from both Mr. Drummond representing the banks and Mr. Mallett representing the consumers of credit. Are we getting into an actual situation where credit is becoming more expensive for many of your folks? Maybe we'll lead with Mr. Mallett and then go to Mr. Drummond.
Well, I'll start with the latest comment. Our work on credit card issues has to do not with the cost of credit on credit cards, but with respect to transaction costs, what the business has to pay to accept a cardholder payment for their goods and services, and that's really the focus of our work on that area. But what we've also noticed, and what we're tracking, is what is the interest rate you're paying on your largest loan or line of credit. And we are noticing a slight uptick in the cost of credit. We think that the average loan amount is around 2 3/4 points above prime. There are 12% or 13% of our members are paying 6 points above prime or more.
Yeah, I looked at your chart. It's quite shocking, really.
A lot of that is BDC. A lot of that are credit unions, and a lot of that are the specialty asset financing companies. Now, they are small players in the small business market. BDC traditionally represents about 3% of our members' activities. Our latest survey shows about 6%. So there seems to be an increase in their work with our members, but it's still by no means a major portion. The specialty asset finance companies, I believe, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's still less than 10% of our members use those. So roughly 2/3 of our members are using one of the traditional Canadian domestic banks, 3% are using a foreign bank, and about 15% are using a credit union. So
Can we just get a comment from Mr. Drummond? Yeah. We're out of time. Mr. McKay wanted Mr. Drummond briefly on this question.
First, let me just say I object to your characterization that the EDC and BDC are being left with the questionable loans and the banks are creaming off the crop. And in fact, if you look at the portfolio of BDC in particular, you will find that these are not the questionable loans. They're in the prime loan territory. And in EDC, it's not a question of we take the good ones and they're taking the poor ones. We've been a partnership on all of these loans. So I really don't think that the characterization is what's going on in the Canadian credit market. I'll come back to my point you raised on the cost of credit. A Canadian bank that wants to raise 5-year funding would face Government of Canada plus 300 basis points. 2 years ago, you would have got a commercial real estate mortgage from a Canadian bank at probably the Government of Canada rate plus 175. How can you do that right now? Their cost is plus 300. So, of course, the cost of credit has gone up. Prime has gone down to 250. The bank's cost of funds have not gone down in parallel with Prime. So, of course, the pricing has become an issue. So there's an access to credit issue, not from the banks, but as you say, from the non-banks. But absolutely there's a pricing of credit issue, and that is because the cost face, because of the difficulties in the corporate bond market, have not gone down commensurately.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Drummond. Thank you, Mr. McKay. Mr. Carrier, s'il vous plaît.
Bonjour, messieurs. Et Monsieur Carrier.
Good morning, gentlemen. I was listening very attentively to each of your respective presentations. I also believe that the main message from your presentations is that the situation is under control in terms of access to credit. Mr. Hodgson says that BDC and EDC are actually doing a good job, that the rate of access to credit seems to be meeting the demand. However, last Monday, the TD Bank Financial Group had set an outlook for a larger deficit in 2011. We're talking about $81 billion of deficit, which is $18 billion higher than the government's outlook. That seems to imply that you're much more bearish, much more pessimistic about this country's fiscal future. Now, even though credit seems to be meeting demand, you don't talk about the near-term and immediate future. Are we going to be able to fill the demand in the short term? And regarding that very situation, the situation of access to credit, do you think that additional measures are needed to stimulate the economy so that you will be in a position to sustain the offering of credit? There are people who are pessimistic, and so they don't even apply for loans or credit, and this is not a good economic situation. Mr. Drummond, you say that many of your people are experts and analysts, so I'll let you answer first. Do you believe that under the current economic action plan, things are going well, and that the banks will be able to continue meeting the demand for credit? I see the outlook as follows. I think there's going to be a lot of difficulty. I think there's going to be a slight recovery in 2010, 2011. And then after that, I think there's going to be a very protracted period over several years to address the problems that are arising now, particularly concerning the U.S. and the $1 trillion deficit that will be posted for upcoming years. Their debt, in fact, their GDP debt ratio is going to hit some 40%, and so it's going to take many, many years for things to get restored. U.S. banks and Western European banks have to increase their capital that has deteriorated or been written down. I think there is going to be some slight growth in the economy, but we're talking about a depressed rate of growth, perhaps hovering around 3%. For 2011 to 2015, we're talking about 2 to 2.5%. I don't think Canada needs to take more fiscal measures. I'm very, very concerned over the deficit, the $40 billion deficit. We have to be concerned over the price of our commodities and our exports, and also the price of our natural resources. And that's one of the major differences between Glenn and myself. That is the fiscal outlook. I see the recovery of commodity prices as rather weak in future years because the demand at the global level is very, very weak. My next question is for the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. In the documents that you've circulated, you identify some pockets of the economy that are much more pessimistic. Furniture stores, certain vehicle outlets are having trouble. And in fact, they are very, very pessimistic regarding their future. Do you think any additional measures taken by the government are needed in order to inspire more confidence?
Demand for loans is certainly very important for ensuring that the economy can bounce back as effectively as possible. The measures that we tend to agree to mostly are really making sure that there's good information in the marketplace, making sure that lenders have appropriate knowledge of what sector performance is. And one of the problems we have been tracking is really, availability of credit is a high degree of concern with our members. We are noticing that existing banking relationships are being supported, and we haven't found to date a large case where financial institutions have decided just to cut off financing to large swaths of the economy. We did notice that in 1990, and we believe that's what made the 1990 recession worse than it should have been, because lots of healthy companies were being cut off at the knees by financial institutions saying, oh, you're a restaurant, or you're in the forestry business, or you're in the auto sector, we're going to cut your loan or your line of credit in half.
Okay.
We have not seen that to a large degree. We're starting to get a number of questions about that from some of our members, but it's something that we really have to watch in the next couple of months.
Thank you. Thank you. Go to Mr. Menzies, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming. And I stand by my suggestion that it is good to bring financial experts after or with the parliamentary budget officer, because I think, and I stand by that. I think this is very, very helpful to get a broad brush from you folks that are dealing with it every day. So once again, thank you for coming, and thank you to Mr. McCallum for agreeing to my great suggestion. I wanted to follow up on where I was going with Mr. Page yesterday, but some of my colleagues have brought up the non-bank asset-backed commercial paper, and we saw some of the worst outcomes of the lack of what I would suggest common securities regulation in this country at the case in Quebec. And yet Quebec seems to be the major pushback, albeit my home province of Alberta is still struggling with the issue. Can I have your comments very quickly? I think you're probably all on the record as to, I'm not going to ask you to suggest whether or not the asset-backed commercial paper debacle would have been prevented, but is there a potential that a common securities regulator may help prevent something such as this in the future? To whoever wants to. It looks like all four of you are ready now. Finn.
I'll take that one. Thank you, if I may, Mr. Chairman. A common securities regulator would be very helpful for the securities issuing industry, the securities issuing business, and for their clients, because you have some clarity, better clarity of regulation, better clarity of enforcement mechanisms, better international cooperation, which is important to free trade in securities, which I think is an appropriate goal for policy. However, the notion that a single regulator or a national regulator would necessarily ward off types of the types of trouble such as we saw in the ABCP market, I think is probably attaching a few hopes too many to the program. Similar failures happened in other markets where there were single regulators. The UK has a financial services authority that is an Uber regulator, and I would not hold out the UK marketplace as an example of success for regulation in financial services in the past 2 years. So I'd point out also that with respect to ABC in particular, you had failures on the part of the issuers to understand what they're issuing. You had failures on the part of distributors to understand what they're distributing. You had failures on the part of the overseers to understand what they're regulating. And you had failures on the part of buyers to understand what it was they're buying. So there's plenty of things going on there in that market that didn't function very well. And one of the key issues, I think, is that those managerial incentives, those risk management incentives, do need addressing. But I wouldn't like to see them being addressed in a top-down mode from a Canadian regulator or a federal regulator.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I'm happy at a drop of a hat to give a sales pitch for a single securities regulator, but I don't want to pretend that would have stopped that problem.
No, that's not what I'm asking.
No, I do applaud the approach as in the Hawken document. I must admit, I'll be transparent. I've got baggage. That was one of my jobs in the late 1990s, was trying to get a common securities regulator. Obviously, it goes without saying I failed miserably. We're still at it. But at the end of that endeavor, I came to the conclusion, get Ontario, a couple of other provinces in, and just do it with the parties of the willing. And you look at Quebec on the harmonized GST, it's not part of the official tax base, and it's virtually the same. Quebec is not in the personal income tax collection agreement, and the base is virtually the same. And I think we've been fussed around too with that, about the necessity of getting everybody in. If we've got a critical mass, I think we'll get what we need out of it. And I think the Hawken report put us on the right path towards that.
Okay, there's about 30 seconds if someone else wants to comment. Mr. Hodgson.
Well, we're on the record for a long time calling for a single regulator, and I think the Finn's made the case. It's all about efficiency, improving efficiency, information flow, but it wouldn't have solved the problem, would have prevented the problem from happening unless they suddenly had better foresight than everybody else in the world.
Okay. You've got 10 seconds if you have a quick yes or no.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree with the Common Securities Regulator.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Menzies. Mr. Bracetti, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to witnesses. Always interesting having a panelist of economists before us. One of the troubling items that I'd like to bring up is something that I'm seeing of late is this the deficit. It's acceptable the government's going to deficit all of a sudden, but we're throwing around billions like they're millions. And the government just a couple of months ago forecasted $64 billion of deficit in the next 2 years. So we had Mr. Page yesterday, 73. Mr. Drummond, I think you're at what, 82 now? Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Is there a reason you're at 82 billion and the parliamentary officers at 73 billion?
This question's come up a lot of times. Can I just take 1 minute and maybe explain how the government and the parliamentary budget officer does this? Because I think there's some confusion.
Well, that's what the question is. Yeah, I'm asking you the question. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I just the government, of course, starts off, takes the average of the private sector forecast, and to their credit, on January 27th, they didn't believe the private sector forecast, and they actually lowered the forecast for the key factors of nominal GDP. The parliamentary budget officer is updating that by the revised average of the private sector forecast. There's a huge range within that. As we indicated, we're at the bottom of the range. Glenn, by coincidence, is at the top of that range.
No, I understand that, but is it based on growth?
All I did in that number that gave the 83 billion is I took everything in the budget as a given, and all I did is submit my economic assumptions instead of the budget economic assumptions. I didn't redo anything else. It's just purely my more pessimistic take on the economy.
Okay. And Mr. Hodgkin, your number?
Well, our forecast is very much driven by an economic model, which we run 4 times a year. We run it every quarter. So we ran it in September, in the middle of the financial crisis. We actually did the reforecasting 2 weeks later.
But your number is probably going to be closer to 90 billion?
90? Frankly, I can't give you a number because our forecast is not done yet. And of course, the forecast is critical for revenue growth for government, assuming that spending is as planned. But it's really all the impact of the revenue side of the slowdown we're seeing right now in investment across the country.
Well, the revenue growth is dependent on the economic growth.
Absolutely.
So if you feel that economic growth is not going to increase and actually decrease, and it's at the bottom end, then the revenue growth of the government is going to decrease, and that meaning a bigger deficit.
That's right.
Okay.
Not the way you're postulating. A lower deficit than the conference board would have forecast previously, but their forecast was way above the average before. And I don't know what he's going to lower it to, but you can't imply, I think, as you just did, that their forecast of the deficit is going to be higher than the government's. They're higher than mine.
I didn't imply anything. Well, Mr. Roman, I didn't imply anything. He said that the economic forecast was going to be even worse, and that meant worse than yours. Okay, so then we're going to see who the worst of the worst is. But I still think that I still think that the government deficit is way understated. So I think we're headed for a little bit more trouble than anticipated. But having said that, and seeing how the forecasters or economists have done such a great job, I'm going to give you guys the benefit of the doubt, since we've been hearing very little money has actually been spent up to date. So let's assume this money is going to get spent, whether it's going to be in the next 6 months or 12 months. What happens if the money gets spent correctly? And what happens if the money does not get spent correctly? So I'll decide what I feel, whether the money will get spent correctly or not from the latest budget.
Well,
But I want to know what will happen either outcome.
Parliament just approved the budget for next year,
Right.
which starts in about 10 days'
Yes, I know
time.
that. And I say let's assume that the money's going to be spent, whether in 6 months or 12 months. After the money gets spent, what will happen?
It'll provide stimulus to the economy.
Will it provide jobs, or will revenues
course.
increase for government?
Of course, that's the whole point behind a stimulus package, where you're adding stimulus between 1.5% and 2% of GDP.
Okay. And what
it's
happens
gonna-
if the money doesn't get spent properly?
Well, the stimulus won't be as great. I mean, that's a very simple arithmetic exercise. We think the government is going to be challenged, frankly, getting the machinery in place to ensure, for example, that the infrastructure spending happens by summer or early fall, because it's a challenge to get, whether it's 12 billion or 20 when you add the provinces in, of new money out the door. We all know that that's a challenge. I spent years of my career grappling with regulators, for example, federal, provincial, trying to get them to approve projects faster. So you've got to go through that whole project identification, approval cycle, letting contracts, all that has to happen. And that's the challenge that a lot of us have had with infrastructure spending, in that notionally it's the right thing to do because you have very high domestic content, you have a lot of stimulus through it, but actually finding useful things to spend on is not easy. So
My point exactly. Mr. Drummond, do you have a feeling?
Very quickly.
Well, we had estimates in the January 27th budget of what the economic impact would be. In our forecast is embedded two differences. First, we don't have the overall impact as large. And secondly, we have the timing quite a bit differently. We have much less of an impact in 2009 and more of it into 2010. And that's just based on the natural history of this, and particularly, as Glenn mentioned, on the infrastructure, particularly some of the infrastructure, for very good reasons, is to be tripartite finance, provinces and municipalities, and it's just not going to start tomorrow. There's lags to that. It's not a criticism of government, a fault of the government. That's just the reality. So a fair bit of the stimulus that was in the budget referring to 2009, I don't believe will come until 2010. But it will come, and it's part of the reason why we do forecast a return and an economic return to growth in 2010.
So what happens if there's an...
I'm sorry, Mr. Pachetti. We're over time here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll go now to Mr. Cramp, please.
Welcome, gentlemen, and to your imperfect world. In the world of science, of course, things can be exact, but in the forecasting business, it certainly isn't abstract, because you're dealing with a little thing called humanity. And I've never met anything quite as predictable or unpredictable as that yet. Matter of fact, of course, we seem to have this changing world, uncharted waters, and I think everybody recognizes that. Of course, we had the PBO here yesterday, and essentially in the course of a few weeks, he even junked his original forecast. So as Mr. Drummond certainly has, and I quote from one of his statements when he says, "This has certainly been a humbling experience." And so knowing that, my concern, of course, is how we react as a government to this. Do we react every time there is a movement? Do we revise an entire economic plan on a daily basis? How do you react in an intelligent, capable fashion when a lot of the factors, quite frankly, are beyond our control, whether it's the Obama administration? So knowing the fact that we have a deficit that could be 60, 70, 80 billion dollars by some estimates over the period of time, obviously everybody would prefer the lower portion of that. But is it a fair statement to say that at least we have the financial capacity, you mentioned the debt to GDP ratio, to move forward with a plan, knowing that we have the financial capacity to deal with that, and at least move on a path that is a solid sense of direction so we can rationalize? Would that be a fair comment, Mr. Hodgson?
Interesting question. Well, first of all, I think we should be thankful as a country that we did the right thing, resolving our debt problems, debt and deficit problems back in the mid-1990s. And it's really striking to me the fact that not just the federal government, but virtually everybody across the country got their act together and we got debt ratios under control. We paid down debt. And that's part of the reason why Canada's in a special place, I would argue. We're actually able to provide more stimulus relative to our economy than almost everybody except maybe the U.S. I mean, in Britain, you're getting pushback now from the Bank of England, encouraging the government not to stimulate a second round because they're worried about the stock of debt and the huge borrowing requirements that the British government has going to the market right now. How do you respond to the current circumstances? Well, I think you start with a plan, and I see a plan. You have a plan that's going to roll forward. Clearly, it'll have to be adjusted and adapted as we go along. I don't think you react to every incident. Understand that growth could be much darker this year and revenues will be impacted and the deficit will be deeper. But the good news story for me as a country is we can afford it. I would be more challenging probably 2 years from now when we come back and see growth restored and then ask questions about whether the path to get back to balance is aggressive enough. Okay. But I'm going to save that for 18 months.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, you know, we can be optimists, we can be pessimists, we can be realists. And the one thing that does disturb me, and this is certainly not a slam against our media friends, but in some cases there appears to be there seems to be a race to be the bad news bearers. And quite honestly, when you take a look at some of the information per se that is out there, we all know that media coverage certainly does influence consumer confidence. And excessively negative coverage quite simply is going to drive down that confidence, or it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to some particular extent. I mentioned this the other day. Now, we all recognize that the numbers are bad. I think there isn't a Canadian and a parliamentarian or an economist that doesn't recognize the straits we're in. But do you feel at some particular point that we're just simply seem to be ramping up this downside risk without taking into account a number of the positive possibilities and realities that we do have? I'll leave that open to whoever would like to comment.
I don't buy the line of argument that the media is distorting it, nor that affects the news is terrible, and there's no way around it. And in fact, for every example you could put to me where you think the media has exaggerated the downside, I could point a counterexample. Okay. We have had in the last week 4 increases in key variables in the U.S. housing market. And I picked the U.S. housing market as an example because that's one of the criteria we need in Canada. We need the U.S. housing market to get back. We've had an increase in housing starts, resale, new homes, and the prices. And the media's jumped all over this, and it's phenomenal. Housing starts in the United States went up 22% from January to February. It blared on all the front pages how positive this was. They are at 1/3 the level they were a year ago. They're abysmally low. The only reason they went up is because they couldn't go any lower. They went in January. I could have spun that story in a totally different fashion. Look how low it is. Aren't we depressed how low they were? And we've talked about Geithner's plan. They talked about the toxic assets. That's the second key condition. We've got to get these toxic assets separated from the U.S. bank's books so they can lend it. There is a very good chance that plan won't work. And yet it was given very charitable treatment by the media. The markets reacted up 6 to 8% around the world on that basis. I could have come and written a story on that thing. Look, we're not even going to know to May. We know there's enough incentive for people to buy. We don't have any idea whether there's enough incentive this the bankers decide this could fall flat. I mean, didn't find a lot of people taking that, and so I find it on both sides. But I myself, I'm getting messages from people like I'm pretending I'm single-handedly pulling down the economy because I got a negative forecast, and I go, you know, the day I got that, it was release of the capacity utilization rate in Canada for the 4th quarter. It's the lowest number in the history of this country. Like, what are you going to say? And if you're a business, I mean, it comes back a little bit to the asset-backed commercial paper. Like, do you see it the way it is in reality, or do you just sugarcoat it and you end up with problems? And if I'm in Ted's world and the capacity utilization number is really low, I want to know that, and I want to do something about the management of my business so I don't get caught off with unintended inventories. If you just put the blinders on, then you're not going to get anywhere.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pratt. We'll go to Mr. McCallum again, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the risk of belaboring the point, I'd like to ask Don Drummond, can he just clarify for us so that it is clear, what is your understanding for the next 2 years? What is the government's estimate of the deficit? What is your estimate of the deficit?
Well, the government's estimate is simple. They haven't publicly changed it since January 27th.
No, I mean, what is the number?
We all know that. Well, what their what is it? 37 billion as a hit was I can't remember exactly precisely the number, and our cumulative total we have it just slightly under 40 billion for the fiscal year 2009 and 41 billion slightly over. And the only difference between the two is I substituted our current economic assumptions for the economic assumptions that were underlying the budget. That's not a full-fledged different view on the budget, and I haven't assumed any different revenue or expenditure relationships or different programs, simply on the basis of economic assumptions.
So if you look at the dollar value of the government's assumption over 2 years, and
well,
of
ours
yours,
was $18 billion higher than theirs.
Right.
Roughly a difference of $9 billion in each of those years. And that's basically taking the level of nominal GDP difference and multiplying it by the 15% average tax rate. So if you took it revenues divided by GDP, it's roughly 15%. So an average government's tax 15% of nominal income. And I looked at the sensitivity of employment insurance, and my higher unemployment rate adds about $1 billion. So that's how you got our number.
That's great. Thank you very much. Mr. Hodson. That's great to get clarity, Ted. We like clarity, like the Clarity Act. Mr. Hodson, after that little disruption, again for the sake of clarity, 2009, can you tell us approximately what your assumption is on real GDP?
Okay, I'll give you a
in
ballpark.
your revised forecast.
We're marking down right now, it'll be much closer to 2%.
I beg your pardon?
It'll be closer to a 2% contraction of the real economy than our previous forecast.
Okay.
Simply because we're looking at the investment numbers across the economy, and you're seeing a rout in terms of investment plans. And I think Ted confirmed that. Bottom-up analysis from your members. You're seeing people really pulling back in their investment intentions.
So you're converging on Don Drummond in a sense.
He's still not low enough. He's getting
and can you give us the order of magnitude, or maybe you haven't done this yet, of your 2-year deficit? We've got the government at 64. We've got TD Bank at 82. We've got the parliamentary budget officer at 73. Can you tell us, not necessarily to the closest billion, but where in that range you would like to find yourself?
Well, I can't even tell you to the billion because, frankly, we use very different tools to get there. Don gave you a pretty nice snapshot of how they do it. We actually crank up our model, do the national forecast. We then do a separate fiscal forecast driven by the fund. So we have a model-based forecast that we use. And as a poor little think tank, we can't do that for free, unfortunately. So part of the reason we have, for example, a contractual relationship with the Department of Finance is to give them on a regular basis that advice, which at one point we actually had with this committee going back 2 or 3 years. So I can't give you a single number, but based on the logic that Don walked you through, it's clearly going to be a deeper deficit over the next 2 years.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
You have a minute if you want.
No, I'll share it with others.
Thank you, Mr. McCallum. Mr. Bernay.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wish to tell you that I agree with you. I believe that the cause of the crisis that we are experiencing in Canada is rooted in the U.S. But I wish to ask you a question regarding the statements made by a witness who appeared before this committee last Monday. The witness had actually named some of those who were responsible for the current economic crisis. He said that those who caused the current global crisis were American politicians, be they Republicans or Democrats. Allow me to elaborate on his line of reasoning, and then I'm going to ask for your comments. He said that at the beginning of 2000, American politicians set a very noble goal that was to allow all Americans to own their own homes. By doing so, the government asked Fannie Mae and Fannie Mac to guarantee loans, to guarantee mortgages that ordinary Americans wouldn't have otherwise been able to receive because they were not able to put down any payment. There was no private institution that would have made such a loan. So by asking Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to underwrite a very high-risk mortgage, private sector banks went ahead because the risk was being shared. The crisis started at the beginning of this century. Those mortgages were securitized and then they were bought by international financial institutions, and that's exactly how this financial crisis turned into an economic crisis. To our witnesses' mind, this was not the fault of bad capitalists, but U.S. politicians. What are your thoughts on that?
I believe everything the member said or reported is roughly correct, except the history is longer. If you go back to the Community Reinvestment Act in the United States, we have a much longer history going back to the beginning of the 1990s and even earlier in different incarnations, where Congress and legislators pushed mortgage lenders to put money back into low-income communities, specifically because they thought banks weren't lending as much as they ought to people near the age of creditworthiness. Now, the pressure emerged from Congress, from the House Financial Services Committee in particular, and also from the White House. And in 1998, President Clinton extended or pushed hard on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to broaden their lending activities. And what Franklin Raines said at the time was that there are too many homeowners who are just a notch below creditworthiness, and we want to reach out to them with our lending programs. And guess what? He was right. They were just a notch below creditworthiness, but that we didn't know for sure until very recently. The program, yes, it was broadly expanded by President Bush, who carried on and with the mandate of extending home ownership to low-income communities. Lots of indicators show it. You saw ownership at the bottom end of the price range, at the entry-level price range, boost up relative to other income ranges over this particular period, and you saw debt accumulation among those households build up at an unusual rate in a response to the incentives created by the mortgage lenders.
There's about a minute left, Mr.
Drummond.
I agree that the government does have its share of responsibility, but I think it's too simple. I also lay the blame on those who were responsible for regulation, such as Alan Greenspan. They should have been able to foresee the problems of the subprime market, and they should have imposed regulation at that point. I also blame investors. Why did they purchase bundles of subprime mortgages when the return was so low, when the risk was so high? In fact, I have absolutely zero sympathy with those investors who made such huge mistakes. They are adults. They were able to analyze risk. I also blame ordinary people. Why did Americans take out a mortgage that they couldn't afford? There's just no logic in it. In fact, some lenders didn't even ask for proof of income. And when we did follow the paper, we actually learned that some people had zero income. Are we supposed to have sympathy for those people? Or are we supposed to blame the government? The government is responsible. It's true, it does have some responsibility, but it can't be blamed for everything. There were too many people who took out mortgages when they didn't have any money. So regulators can be blamed, and the investors who turn them into complicated instruments means that everyone was responsible. Mr. Mulcair. I want to continue asking questions to Mr. Drummond. Indeed, today in the U.S., there's a whole series of new measures that are going to be introduced. Allow me to suggest that some of the things that we did in the aftermath of Enron was to make accounting rules much more rigorous. And in fact, that was part and parcel of the problem. Mark-to-market is a notion that was quite challenging. And now, to address the crisis, this very real crisis that is going to cause some serious problems, for instance, $1 trillion is being is being invested in the U.S., just like the government had did after the Vietnam War to pay back its debt. And there was high inflation to pay back that money. And how did they do it? It was by printing money. We're talking about $10 trillion. So I'm sure the Caritis are looking at this, and everybody is saying that we're socialists, but in fact we're all social creditists. But what are the other challenges? What are the other problems that are being hidden because of that attitude? As I said in response to the question about the outlook, I see the outlook in 3 points. I think the challenges are huge. There is the debt burden in the U.S. In 1995, in 1996, Canada took measures that I think the U.S. could emulate. The U.S. puts a lot of weight on the voice of the minority. Banks need to restore capital, not only in the near term, but they need to restore the capital that's being furnished by the government. They need to. The entire shadow banking sector has fallen apart. And one can never forget that we started with a real problem in the global economy. The U.S. was spending too much, and the savings levels in other countries was much too high. And now, rather than consumers in the U.S. spending too much money, it's the government, the U.S. government, that's spending too much money. From the very beginning, we thought that there might be a benefit in an economic slowdown. We saw that in the private sector, but we noticed that consumer spending has now been replaced by government spending. We're exactly in the same position. We see these same trade imbalances in the world, and it's probably even worse today. Do you believe, then, that there's going to be inflationary pressure exerted over a 5 to 10 year term? Yes, that's something that has to be mitigated by the central banks. We can't control this over the span of several months. The risk is to leave inflation rates too low for too long, just like Alan Greenspan was responsible for. That was a huge mistake, and I hope that we don't make that mistake again. In my forecast, I hope that in 2 or 3 years, we will be meeting the 2% inflation target. That's more on the fiscal side of things. Since we are talking about the access to credit study, I will ask one last question about that very specific study. Right now, there are certain charter banks, not your bank, but charter banks that are focusing in on the market, on the mortgage market, that is, with a rate of 2%. In fact, Desjardins is offering a rate of less than 1.5%. Now, I agree entirely with you. Rates are not going to stay at their levels forever. And I'm not talking about fixed levels here. Desjardins is not offering a fixed rate. In fact, it's almost like a computer game with moving parts. Try and get that mortgage rate fixed for 5 years, and then all of a sudden it jumps up to 5 or 7%. Shouldn't somebody be monitoring exactly what's going on with that mortgage market? Because demand is being created. People only make their decisions based on their monthly payments. Do we need a sort of oversight framework? That's a remarkable situation for 2 reasons, because the 0.5 bank rate and the difference with the prime rates are very low. In fact, those spreads are at their lowest levels ever. I think banks are looking to restore those spreads, and we can expect a slight recovery in the economy. In fact, by early next year, the banks, the Bank of Canada, the Fed Reserve Board, and the Bank of England are actually going to increase their interest rates, probably not by huge margins. but the normal Bank of Canada rate should be about 3.5, 4.5. And I think they need to restore those levels as soon as possible. I don't think it's going to start before 2010, before the economy actually starts getting revived. I am worried about inflation. I think the problem, however, can be prevented. However, it will be addressed once the economy becomes stronger.
Advise that I have to get the consent of the committee because there are 4 members. So do I have consent of the committee for Ms. Hall Finley to ask a question? Okay. Okay, Ms. Hall Finley, please.
I promise. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, colleagues, for your gentlemanly behavior today. Quick question for Mr. Hodgson. You mentioned earlier that you, although not published yet, have revised forecasts in terms of GDP, and you mentioned some contraction, some numbers. Can you just, because of all of the little bit of confusion in the discussion we've had so far, can you just repeat for me what your forecasts are now for the next number of quarters in terms of GDP?
Well, that's a painful exercise, but I'll go through it. We saw the economy contracting with the forecast we did just before Christmas, because we do it on a quarterly cycle. When the national accounts come down, that's when we run the model. The forecast we did just before Christmas saw a contraction of about 0.5% for the country for the year, growth returning in the third quarter, and then strengthening in the fourth quarter. The profile will be more or less the same, but it's going to be down a notch. So you're going to see a really bad first quarter. I think there's a consensus amongst everybody who does a forecast. Some have talked about a contraction of 9%. I think that's too high, but you're going to see 5 or 6% contraction.
For the first quarter?
For the first quarter. Even though, again, we're getting a little bit of good news as we go along, but you simply look at all the other factors. And the thing that troubles us the most right now is the contraction we're seeing in investment.
Right.
Whether it's through polling, whether it's through the kind of information that TED has, actually looking at investment intentions or the numbers that you're seeing as we get the data down. Very sharp contractions in manufacturing, Southern Ontario and Quebec, but particularly in the oil sand. In the Alberta right now, there's a real recoiling of investment intentions around oil sand expansion, around the upgraders, for example, where people are simply canceling things. Probably based
overall,
upon a belief that oil was going to $35 a barrel and staying there. I think there's been actually a step up on a global basis in oil prices, and we're going to see oil back at maybe $60 a barrel.
But generally, over the next 2, 3, 4 quarters, what do you see in terms of?
Certainly the first 2 quarters of this year will be sharp contraction Q1, not quite as sharp, but certainly contraction again in Q2. Yeah. And then we get into an area of debate, whether there's actually going to be enough fiscal stimulus because infrastructure spending will start happening in earnest in Q3, which is summer into the early fall. But we certainly expect that the economy will be growing again by Q4, and at that point we start a path back towards a more normal state that'll take most of 2010. Our 2010 forecast will probably be in the mid-2s, so growth of around 2.5%, 2.10, and the economy not really getting back to potential and beyond as it normally does until 2011.
But I think from what you said, you still see Q2 and Q3 as contracting still, and
Q2 certainly within the forecast. Q3 is an area of debate inside the shop right now, looking at a whole variety of what people would see as extraneous factors, like inventories. Are they going to go up or down? Right. And how quickly will people start responding to the investment recoil and start building investment plans out again?
Okay, thank you. Tom?
You have 2 minutes.
Question for Mr. Mallet. Your chart in terms of the figure 7, the interest rate you're paying on the largest loan currently outstanding. Clearly, the line at the bottom, the prime plus 6% or greater, leaps off the page. But my question is historically, like, how does that relate to what we've seen in the past? Is just on a one-look basis now, that jumps off the page. Is that significantly different, however, from what we've seen in the past?
We've never asked this question in this particular way. So we've known that there's been an awful lot of our members who have high interest rate kind of instruments that they're using. Many small businesses use credit cards to finance their businesses, and of course that number would be off the page, over there on Gled's side. we do look at who are offering these kinds of loans or who's demanding it, and it's typically the again BDC kind of loans. It's credit unions are more likely to be in that category, as well as the asset company, especially asset companies. So it's not typical of the domestic banking industry. There's a few people that say that they're domestic bank customers who are paying those kind of rates. What we're noticing, though, is that this time around there's a lot more flexibility in where the interest rates are. There seems to be more pricing for risk in the market now, where in 1990, generally the notion was that if you didn't qualify for a prime plus 2 mortgage or loan or line of credit, then you weren't allowed to get any financing. This time around, there's some discussion of, well, you're moving to prime plus 3, prime plus 4, but at least you're still getting a loan. And our members were complaining 20 years ago that, boy, they would have loved to have the chance to pay prime plus 3 for a loan, but their bank wouldn't let them do that. They were saying, no, we're not going to lend you any more. We haven't seen that to date, and really what our role is to measure. I mean, we're not in the forecasting business. We've often thought maybe we should, but you know, forecasting the future with imperfect current information isn't great. So what we try to do is provide current information to help Glenn and Don and others do their jobs better. So really what we're noticing is a bit more reliance on price for risk in the financing area, and less concern that banks are just, or financial institutions are just cutting off loans to anybody just because they're in a certain sector. We've noticed a couple of comments from members along those lines, and we're going to be monitoring that over the next couple of months to see if it gets worse. And we'll certainly let anybody, policymakers, know about what kind of changes and adjustments we see here.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you both, and thank you again, colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you. Monsieur Laforêt, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed, well, I was paying attention to Mr. Menzies' question, and I think he probably was expecting a different answer, but he was told that a single securities regulator would have not been able to prevent the purchase of ABC paper in Quebec. And I know what your position is. You do favor a single securities commission, a single securities regulator, for several reasons. And I'm sure that you are aware that the government of Quebec has unanimously stated that securities falls within provincial jurisdiction, and the government is against the idea of establishing a single securities commission. It would not have been able to prevent the acquisition of asset-backed commercial paper, particularly by certain Quebec financial institutions. This probably ties into the fact that there was a lack of caution, a lack of prudence being practiced by investors. They were motivated by other interests. Mr. Drummond, previously you said that it was so obvious that ABC paper was risky, and that for you it was only natural to not venture into that market. But my question is, were there any publications produced by the TD Bank that reflects that opinion? Did the TD Bank provide its clients general information on asset-backed commercial paper? Given our fears over the mortgage market in the U.S., we understood that there's competition between institutions. However, I can say that not only did our bank refrain from purchasing ABCP, but it's not included in any of our mutual funds. We have shared the benefits of that market with our clients, not necessarily the clients of other banks. This is a competitive sector we're working in. But in your document, you say that your services provide analysis information on investment returns. At the time, ABCP was a very fashionable, very popular product. But did your institution, did the TD Bank produce anything about that, over that? I don't think it's the job of private banks to provide that sort of service. If you're talking about a governance structure or an oversight structure, that belongs to a regulator, not a private bank. Mr. Poshman.
Vote, just to let the witnesses and the members know. So we're going to check in terms of the length of the bells. Sorry, Monsieur Laforêt.
Thank you. In 2002, DBRS, the bond rating service, they published a positive assessment of non-bank-backed ABCP in the Canadian market. At the same time, the Standard & Poor's, another rating agency, refused to rate, and they issued a document that explained exactly what their concerns were with the quality of the product, and it was for exactly those reasons that that the product eventually failed. So there was competing information available in the marketplace. It was not acted on for an interesting set of reasons that involve incentives on the part of buyers, and distributors, and ratings agencies as well.
Merci beaucoup. Merci.
Okay, merci.
Thank you.
Okay, the bells are 29 minutes, I'm told. I do have, as the chair, I'm going to take the next conservative spot. I wanted to ask on a couple of issues. The first one, Mr. Drummond, you raised the shadow banking sector in your response to another colleague's question. On Tuesday, we had a witness before the committee who said that one of the issues was the fact that the sector is not regulated enough in Canada. I mean, he certainly said it's a bigger problem in other countries like the United States, but that in Canada we ought to look at greater regulation of things like hedge funds, derivatives. Asset-backed commercial paper was an example of that. Perhaps, Mr. Drummond, if you want to start, and if anyone else wants to comment, I mean, does that sector need to be better regulated in Canada?
Oh, absolutely. But not Canada can't do it alone. It has to be done in an international context, and I think that's an inevitable result of the discussions going to be held April 2nd in the G20 and held within each country. Is absolutely the regulators, particularly if you look in Canada or even in the United States, because the regulation in the United States is so fragmented relative to what we had. There's a whole host of it. And in fact, probably almost half of the credit that was provided in the United States in 2007 was being provided by non-regulated entities. That proportion wouldn't be nearly that high in Canada, but absolutely the spectrum of coverage of the regulators has to be expanded.
Okay, I appreciate it. Mr. Hodgson, you want to comment?
Well, we just published a paper done by two outside authors, an academic and a former banker, looking at global financial regulation. And the premise is, as I'm seeing now in the media, we have to think about the global requirements, but really act on a local basis. But I'll give you one of the ideas in the paper. In future securitization, for example, as you bundle things together and sell them into the market, we would propose that the originator be required to hold a portion of that for their own book, because that'll change the behavior fundamentally. If you have to hold the risk to term yourself, you're going to take a lot more responsibility for what you're underwriting and for doing ongoing risk evaluation and sort of keeping in touch with what the risk is. So that's on our website, and I was certainly committed to the committee.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And the second issue I wanted to address was, I mean, the whole issue of forecasting is a very important issue. And I think you mentioned this as well, Mr. Drummond. I mean, the budget 2009 forecasts actually were more bleak or conservative or whatever you want to say than the private sector forecasts. So there was some contingency built in there. But as all of you have mentioned, I mean, the forecasts have got much worse since then. And that's sort of been the last 6 months, certainly since last August, all the forecasts have got worse almost every quarter. And that obviously has a tremendous impact. But, I mean, putting on your hat now and being a former Department of Finance official, I mean, what what is a prudent course of action for the government to take then? Because, I mean, the government doesn't want to have sort of be way more bleak and negative than the private sector forecast. You want to be as close as you can to where the economy is going, but if you misjudge it, then it affects all your variables in terms of revenues, in terms of deficit projections. So, and what's a prudent course of action here? This is it's a very, very fluid situation, and it's a very tough thing forecasting. But it's very frustrating as a government to sort of be in that situation and trying to guess where we're going, but at the same time not being overly bleak so that you affect consumer confidence, so that you then make the situation worse. So I know that's a tough question, but it's a tough issue.
It's a tough question, but it's one I got a lot of experience with. I started the Department of Finance in 1977, and that debate's been going on every single minute since then. And believe me, every new minister
Well, I need you to solve it for me here today.
Yeah, and invariably, every new minister of finance wants you to put out something positive because you don't want to depress markets. And I've come to that over 30 years' experience that the only way is to do the best forecast you possibly can, and whether that's viewed as pessimistic or realistic, that's the way you go. If you look at the history of the making of this budget, and this is a tradition that Paul Martin started in 1994, the normal procedure is based on the average of the private sector forecast. So as is usual, a month before the fall update, the Department of Finance did a survey of the private sector forecast, and I'll just refer to nominal GDP because that's the key economic variable. Yeah. The average of the private sector forecast was 1.9% growth in 2009. At that moment, I was sitting with a decline of 3.2%. Just to give you an element of what we're talking about, the difference between my forecast and the average would have been $15 billion on the federal deficit, so a huge range of uncertainty. I was aghast. I thought the 1.9% was totally inappropriate for the basis of a budget. And during the course of the discussions, it was agreed that the budget assumptions, well, the update assumptions would be held open for another week to see if anybody wanted to lower their forecast. And indeed, if you look in the fall update, instead of the 1.9, it was 0.8. And then when Finance came by mid-January to do their last survey, the average of the nominal GDP forecast in the private sector was a decline of 1.5. And again, I didn't believe that. I didn't have the impression that officials of the Department of Finance believed that, and I was urging them, you're not locked into this pattern of just using the average of the private sector. And in fact, at one of the budgets that Ralph Goodale did, they broke that mold as well when they were troubled by the average of the private sector, and they adjusted it. And I said, do that. Do your own. Knock it down. Otherwise, you're just going to have to come and revise it, and you're going to look silly in the budget forecast. And to their credit, instead of using that average of down 1.5, they used 2.6. Now, it still wasn't down as low as mine. And my current forecast for the decline in nominal GDP is 4.5, which is why I've got this $18 billion higher deficit. But I think the finance and the budget and the minister did the right thing in January by not getting locked into this pattern of using the average private sector. I just wish they had gone with a number that was even lower.
Okay. Thank you. My time is up, Mr. Hodgson, very briefly. If you... John, did you...
I had one added thought. There's both the forecast and your anticipated revenues and expenses, but there's also how you actually budget. And one of the points that I've made to the minister, to the department on a number of occasions is that we have to build margins into our budgeting process. At one point, we had a $3 billion contingency fund. I think a contingency of, say, around $5 billion, which is still a very small share of the national budget. I mean, the federal budget is now to about $225 billion. But how much of a slush factor do you want to build in to ensure that you've got some marge de maneuver? It's what good companies do. It's what good organizations do. For me, that's part of good budget planning going forward.
Okay, thank you. Mr. McKay, you have 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to question Mr. Hodgson's optimism in light of basically 2 hours of conversation where we seem to be going down and down and down. And the issue here is that in the government's budget, they put in a stimulus package, which is just under 2%, just taking their figures. We now appear to be really going down a great deal. So I question your optimism on the usefulness or the efficacy of the fiscal stimulus at the size that the government is projected in its budget. Is it now? Is it fair to say that the government should really increase substantially the stimulus package in order to have any impact on the economy?
Mr. Hodgson, very briefly.
Well, I think there's a real difference between how much you do and what you do. For example, I advise a different composition of action. I would have liked to have seen more, for example, dealing with displaced workers, put more into the employment insurance system. If I had a chance right now, I would frankly reinvent employment insurance to shorten the waiting period, to increase the coverage ratio, do things like that, knowing that a lot of that leaks into imports, but people don't save that. They're going to go out and spend that. And that's because I would like to see the stimulus happen sooner, whereas the $12 billion infrastructure spending is going to happen second half of this year, or Don thinks, and even drifting into 2010. So how much you do maybe maybe is not as important as what you do, and the composition really does matter.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for being here this morning. This has been a fascinating discussion, fascinating 2-hour session. Thank you all. You're certainly welcome to come back at any time. If there's any further information, please submit it to the clerk or to me. We'll distribute it to all the members. Meeting adjourned.